So welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Alding. I'll serve as the host for today's seminar. I should say fireside chat without a fire next to our side. As a reminder, we are hybrid. We have friends and colleagues joining us via Zoom. It's a pleasure to have them joining us virtually and thrilled to have a standing room only audience here in the Rubenstein building. We're thrilled to have with us today Elliot Diringer for a conversation in which we will take stock of the international climate effort. Elliot Diringer is a senior policy advisor to the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change in the Biden administration. He's been actively engaged in international climate issues for nearly 3 decades. Prior to joining the State Department, he was executive vice president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, where he regularly worked with and convened conversations with both lead climate negotiators, leaders in the business community, those all engaged in how we tackle the challenge of climate change. During the Clinton administration, he served as Deputy White House Press Secretary, Deputy Assistant to the President. Before that, at the Council on Environmental Quality, he served as the Communications Director and a Senior Policy Advisor. And in his youth, he covered the very first climate change talks, the Rio Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, 1992, as an environmental reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. So Elliot and I are going to start the conversation off as we take stock of the international climate effort, and then I will open it up for questions from the audience. Elliot, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate the invitation. Appreciate the standing room only crowd. And I just want to note that it's been some time since I've had the opportunity to revisit the campus. But one of the best years of my career was actually a year spent here as a Neiman Fellow, which back when I was still an active journalist. Right. This was a fellowship offered to mid-career journalists, and it was an extraordinary opportunity. And it included the opportunity to audit an environmental economics class taught by Rob Stavins.
Wow.
So, so I've spent some time here at the Kennedy School.
That's great. It's great to have you back. So beforehand, Elliot and I were chatting. We've known each other, as I noted earlier, since another century. But I was kind of curious, how many of these COPs have you been to? And the math is daunting. It's 24. So we're going to go through a bit of the history of the climate change talks in a moment. But before doing that, I thought it'd be useful for us to get a sense of what are the key issues? How do you sort of frame the issues? What are sort of the foundational characteristics that make this a tough challenge? And how have some of those sort of fundamental characteristics evolved over the nearly 3 decades that you've worked on this issue?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And back when I first started focusing full-time on climate change, it struck me that there were certain sort of defining characteristics of the issue that made it especially tough from a policy-making standpoint. And I see 4 characteristics there. The first is the fact that this is truly a global issue. The second is that it entails significant uncertainties, which can be tough for policymakers to manage. It also, at least at the start, posed this significant sort of time gap or disconnect. It presented policymakers with the challenge of thinking about actions that entail costs in the present for benefits that wouldn't come until someday in the future. And then, I think something we're all aware of is that that this issue really entails some deep inherent inequities. It brings those to the surface and magnifies them. So I do think that some of the way I see those characteristics certainly has changed over the years. I mean, the fact that it is global, I would say a quintessentially global challenge. The atmosphere is a global commons, right? Which means that we are all dependent on action by others to successfully address this issue. And even if we did a great job reducing emissions here in the United States, if other countries aren't taking corresponding action, then our actions aren't really going to benefit us much. So it requires global action, but it also its global nature poses impediments to action, because it's very easy to argue that, well, unless China and India are acting in a commensurate way, we shouldn't take any action. So I think that actually has been a fundamental obstacle to mobilizing the action we need over the years. I would say I do think we've made significant progress, though, in terms of establishing norms for ambitious action globally and putting in place some semblance of a system of accountability for those norms. And, we could talk a little more about the Paris Agreement. In terms of uncertainty, I mean, when the issue first surfaced, I think scientists put forward a pretty compelling case that this posed an enormous challenge and risk for the world. But, we weren't yet at a point where they could be very precise in terms of the timing of the impacts, the nature of the impacts, the extent of the impacts, or frankly, economists couldn't give us a good handle on the costs of addressing climate change. So enormous uncertainties. Now, obviously, we always undertake decision-making in the face of uncertainty, but it was very easy to sort of exploit those uncertainties as arguments to not act until we had greater certainty. And I think at this point, frankly, we do have much greater certainty. We have a much finer, granular understanding of the science. And actually, at this point, scientists have become comfortable attributing specific events to climate change, which is something, until recently they weren't comfortable doing. We also have a much better sense of the cost and the technology solutions. So I think we've narrowed the range of uncertainty considerably. And likewise, the time gap has narrowed, because the impacts are no longer in the future. They are here and now. We all see that. And the window for the action needed to avert much worse is much narrower. So I think, that's certainly changed. The inequities, I think we all appreciate that those who have contributed least to the problem and have the least capacity actually to address it, either by reducing emissions or by adapting and coping, are the ones who will suffer the most. And that is now more present than ever. And it's playing out in the negotiations at the moment around the issue of loss and damage. But I think this will, the ways in which climate change is magnifying inequities will only become more and more present.
Right. So I want to return to loss and damage in a few minutes. When we talk about some of the uncertainties, I want to follow up on this. We've each worked in a couple of administrations that actually took this issue pretty seriously. We would be engaging, when I came in and worked in the Obama administration, it was right after a Bush administration that had pulled out of Kyoto, had not been thought of as being a very engaged partner on climate policy. The Trump administration showed you could be even less engaged. So you're now working for an administration that's clearly recommitted to this challenge, but there's certainly negotiating partners around the world who look at the United States and they say, how certain can we be that they will be there in 2 years' time or 6 years' time to continue making progress? How do you deal with those concerns about how our domestic politics influences how committed we are in the international sphere?
I mean, it's a fair critique and a fair worry on the part of our international partners. We've been in and out in many ways, but I would say at this point, we have actually achieved a strong alignment between our ambitious international commitments and an ambitious domestic policy that puts us in a position to deliver on those commitments. And hopefully, by virtue of the policies now in place, we are embedding ambitious action in the economy in a way that can sustain regardless of the outcome of future elections. So I think, more and more as the private sector appreciates the risks as well as the economic opportunities presented by this issue and orients itself toward managing those risks and taking advantage of those opportunities, the action becomes embedded in corporate strategies, for instance, in a way that creates momentum that will become self-sustaining.
So you covered, as I noted at the beginning, the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit as a reporter. You were at COP3 in Kyoto, the Kyoto conference, when you were working in the Clinton White House. You've attended a number of COPs as a representative from civil society, from what was then originally the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, and then the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and now in the Biden administration. So first, for those of us who are kind of new, who have less experience with the COPs, the Conference of the Parties, we'll use a lot of acronyms, I'm afraid, just sort of set the scene for us. Like, what typically happens at a COP? What is the different elements of the COP circus, if you will? And then let's talk about a little bit about the evolution of the COPs over time.
Sure, and you're right. The COP is Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, negotiated back in '92, signed by the first President Bush. Sort of the foundational treaty for the international effort. And back then, at the start, COPs were multilateral negotiating forums, and that's the core purpose and remains the core purpose of the COP. But over the years, COPs have evolved into mega events, and sort of the event of the year for people who are involved in the international climate effort, and they typically draw tens of thousands of people, and a lot of people. Most people, I would say, who go to COPs never actually step foot into the negotiations proper. Most of us at the State Department, that's the focus, right? But it's a forum for governments to launch all sorts of other efforts ancillary to the negotiations proper. Endless series of side events where you can learn about any aspect of this issue. So if you're just there to learn, it's a real wealth of opportunity. Companies show up to demonstrate their commitment to addressing the issue, and it's 2 weeks long, and it's a circus, and it's exhausting. And if you think navigating this complex is difficult, okay, last year in Sharm, the signage could have used a little improvement. Finding your way from point A to point B was part of the challenge. Yeah. So evolution.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. I will note, I remember COP5, which was in Bonn, Germany, which is where the Secretariat of the UNFCCC is, because no one else really wanted to host that COP. You had a big COP in Kyoto in 1997, Buenos Aires in COP4 had sort of charted out the so-called roadmap for Kyoto, like how we're going to implement it. And so the view was COP6 was where we're going to make the final deal. And so no one's like, I don't want to be on the road to somewhere else. So it was just in one hotel. It was the Maritime, Hotel Maritime hosted the entire conference. And it's just kind of mind-boggling to think that you could fit an entire COP into just one hotel today, because of how much it has grown. And you're right, it's so much of this other, what we are doing on climate. That's not how are we formally negotiating this part of a UN agreement or that part of a UN agreement. So we had a much smaller approach in the past. But during that period, this sort of Kyoto period, was trying to implement the Berlin Mandate from 1995. So help us understand a little bit about sort of those early years of the climate talks and the COPs, and how you've seen the evolution over time.
So I view the evolution as the emergence in the form of the Paris Agreement as the emergence of a hybrid approach. A hybrid between top-down and bottom-up elements, right? And so you go back to Rio and the Framework Convention. Framework Convention established an objective, okay, which was basically avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So a grand goal, but in qualitative terms, right? It also established some very fundamental principles, foremost being the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. The notion that we all have a responsibility here, but by virtue of different levels of responsibility and capacity, et cetera, our levels of responsibility vary. And that was reflected at that point in a pretty strict bifurcation between developed and developing countries. That was the foundation, and we quickly, discovered that wasn't enough. We needed stronger action, so we wound up in Kyoto, which led to the negotiation of binding emissions targets. Okay, so this was a more top-down approach. Okay, countries, and this was only developed countries, so it sort of reinforced this bifurcation of responsibility. The U.S. and the other developed countries negotiated a set of targets. So it wasn't that we decided our own target, it was a matter of negotiation, and we all had to agree collectively on one another's targets, and those targets were considered legally binding. So it was top down in the sense of negotiated targets and in the sense of them being binding. Now, as we recall, when President Bush came in, the second President Bush, he very quickly made clear what was probably evident to most people anyway, that the U.S. was never joining Kyoto. So Kyoto was clearly not going to be the pathway forward. And the process spent a number of years sort of wandering the desert at that point. We had one of the low points, the Copenhagen conference, where people tried to get another binding agreement, and that collapsed dramatically. And then we wound up with something called the Cancun framework, which was this much more bottom-up approach, which was, yeah, everybody has to do something. Okay, we all agreed on that, but you decide for yourself what you're going to do, and without any real structure or norms. So we tried this top-down thing, which failed. Then we tried this bottom-up thing, which did not deliver sufficient ambition either. And it was clear that neither of those worked. So when it came time for Paris, I think people sort of drew some lessons from what was then a couple of decades of experience and created this hybrid structure, which combines some top-down and bottom-up elements. It's top-down in the sense that we actually adopted a numerical goal of keeping warming well below 2 degrees and with efforts toward 1.5. It has some binding commitments, procedural commitments. Every country has to have a nationally determined contribution. It has to report on its emissions and its progress in implementing its NDC. And those reports are subject to international review. So those are the binding elements. But your commitments, these nationally determined contributions, by that very name, tells you these are not negotiated. These are, you decide for yourself what your commitment is. Of course, there's an expectation that you're putting forward your strongest possible effort and that it is aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. But it was that combination, that finessing, if you will, of top-down and bottom-up elements that led to the agreement in Paris. And I think it reflected sort of an acceptance of the limits of the multilateral process. At one point, I think we thought it was going to deliver the solution. Well, no, it can't. It's facilitating, but the solution has to come from everywhere. So I think we wound up with a more pragmatic approach.
If we were to look back at the text of the Kyoto Protocol, the word adaptation shows up twice in two quite insignificant ways. There is really no meaningful discussion of the issue finance. There's not really much discussion about the term capacity building. And as we've sort of moved forward, as we start look at Bali in 2007 and sort of the Bali roadmap and some of what was being negotiated in Copenhagen, and Copenhagen was a distinctive circus on its own. As someone who was there at the time in the U.S. government, where you had in a room over here heads of state negotiating text, and then over there are like the staff who work for them. And there was a lot of daylight between those rooms, perhaps reflecting then, I think, a lot of daylight in the views that many countries had. But throughout all that, though, we started to see this kind of, I think, expansion of the coverage of the topics and getting more and more serious about issues like adaptation and capacity building and climate finance, including setting goals for climate finance. How do we see, as we've been expanding the set of topics, has that made it easier or harder to make progress in the international climate negotiations?
Well, I think at this point, we often talk about the pillars being mitigation and adaptation and finance or means of implementation. And I think that's a reflection of the reality that we need to make progress on all of those fronts. It's part of, this is a consensus-based process, right? And yes, mitigation is essential to all of us, but for much of the world, countries that are not large emitters, for them, the real challenge is how to cope with the impacts of climate change. So they need people to address adaptation, and that developing countries need support, both on mitigation and adaptation. So those have become essential core elements. I think that it was a necessary sort of broadening of the agenda, if you will. I can't say it's made it any easier, but it never was easy, right?
Okay, so help us understand.
I just want to add, though, that I don't think heads of state went to Copenhagen thinking they were going to be there to negotiate. I think they
I-
expected that they would be presented with an agreement they could merely, endorse.
They were
So-
planning on lunch and a photo.
Yeah.
No, I assure, I can at least say on behalf of a government that was a party to this,
Yeah.
the briefing memo to the President of the United States did not talk about how he was going to be negotiating or barging into a conference room or what have you. So it played out a little differently than anticipated. But when you say we come to consensus and we reach agreement, how much does it matter about the personalities? Who's actually leading both in the host government, who we kind of deputize on some of the thorniest issues. Most of the thorniest issues have these like breakout groups, these working groups that are led by someone from a developed country, someone from a developing country. Give us a little bit of a feel for like the importance of the key personalities in making that kind of progress. So at the end of 2 weeks or 2 weeks and a day or however we tend to go over, we know that we're actually going to get to something for which there is an agreement and there is consensus. And we can say, hey, it may be imperfect, but it is progress.
Yeah, and this notion of consensus, I mean, basically, the parties have never adopted, rules of decision making.
Right.
So nothing is ever subjected to a vote. It basically has to be by consensus or acclamation. And I'm not going to name names, but certainly whoever has the gavel and is prepared to declare consensus,
Yes.
even if there's a delegate in the back of the room waving wildly, no, I object.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, some chairs are more prepared to exercise that form of chairmanship, if you will,
Yes.
than others, and others, it proves in retrospect are completely unequipped for the role. That may have been a contributing factor in Copenhagen, for instance. But no, I think this is true not just in the climate sphere, but across the board. That sometimes your ability to make progress is a function who happens to be occupying a particular seat at a particular moment. No question about that.
So we have this UN process. We have 190 or so countries coming together, trying to agree on language that's going to sort of serve as this policy infrastructure, where we can find coordination, where we think about it, helping try to leverage what we're doing outside of that space. I'd like to sort of walk through 3 different ways in which outside the UN climate talks, there's action that can complement what we as a world are trying to do globally on climate. And so I'd like to talk about smaller group government involved or led processes, talk about the role of civil society, and then the private sector. So the smaller group processes, we have the Major Economies Forum. So this is something that you've participated in now as a member of the US government, but I think you've also attended as a member of civil society in the past as well. Help us understand a little bit, what is the Major Economies Forum and how does it help complement what we're doing in the UN climate talks?
Yeah, so I mean, the international discussion and action among governments on this issue is hardly confined to the UN framework, and it pops up in basically every multilateral forum at this point, whether it's the G7 or the G20. There are pieces of the climate challenge that have been expressively delegated to other forums like ICAO and IMO to address international aviation emissions or international shipping emissions. And it's been really important to embed climate and climate objectives across the board. The Major Economies Forum is a great example. And actually, my sort of history on that goes back before it even existed, actually. And it kind of intersects with civil society because back in 2004 and 2005 at the Pew Center, we organized something called the Climate Dialogue at Pecantico. This was after it was clear that Kyoto wasn't happening. What are we going to do? We brought together some government people, some business people, some civil society people to try to get a consensus on what's the way forward. And one of the recommendations that emerged in that consensus report was the creation of a Major Economies Forum where, I mean, look, the major 20 countries account for 80% of GDP, of global population, and of global emissions. If you got alignment among that set of countries, you're a long ways towards solving the problem. So, the notion was create a forum dedicated to this issue among those countries, which can then help unlock issues and allow progress in the negotiations. So we put the idea out there, and this was during the Bush administration, and they then proposed something called the Major Economies Meeting at the time, okay, which was the sort of the birth of this thing, and it was immediately suspect by other countries as an attempt to undermine the UNFCCC. So that was where it first started. But then when the Obama administration came in, it rebranded it the Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate.
It took several meetings to come up with forum as a substitute for meeting. Yes.
And it actually, as a forum, I think it played a vital role in setting the stage for the Paris Agreement, because it created a space where, mostly at the ministerial level, but occasionally at the leader level, countries came together and kind of pre-negotiated, in a way, a lot of the core issues. So I think it actually demonstrated the value of the concept that we had proposed years earlier. It then, fell into abeyance for a little while, but when President Biden came in, we reinitiated the Major Economies Forum. We've since held, I think, 4 leader-level meetings and a couple of ministerials, because this was in COVID times. These have all been virtual meetings at this point. But it's also its purpose has evolved, because it's no longer so much about discussing issues under negotiation. We've used it more to motivate concrete action. So we've used it as an opportunity for countries come to announce ambitious new efforts of their own, but also to form initiatives, coalitions of the willing, if you will, around particular slices of the climate issue. It was where we first launched the Global Methane Pledge, for instance, which now has more than 150 countries signed on with a goal of reducing methane emissions. So we've launched a series of actions of that sort through the MEF. So I think it continues to play a really important but different role.
Right. So you made a reference to the dialogue at Contico. In the run-up to Paris, you also led, by then I think it was C2ES, or was it still Pew?
I think it was C2ES.
It was C2ES then. You also led an effort where, in a sense, you're trying to create a space to bring in representatives of different governments where they can actually have more candid conversations, because it's kind of before we see text that we want to start bracketing, to use one of the negotiating terms, to saying, I don't agree with that, I want to put brackets around it. And then the chair is trying to say, let's come up with some alternative language so we can remove the brackets. So we're not even into that part where we see sometimes old tensions or conflicts arise among negotiators. So it's trying to think more like the principles level, with principles, using 2 different terms there. But describe a little bit about that effort in the run up to Paris that you did with C2ES, engaging over a number of meetings, heads of delegations, some of the top negotiators that work for them, to try to think through what should this new framework look like.
Yeah, and I think I've definitely observed over the years that these informal spaces are essential in order to help countries make progress in the formal negotiation. In the formal negotiations, countries come with their positions, and it's very formalistic, and nobody wants to budge off their position. And they don't really have the opportunity to even necessarily understand what's behind that position. Why are they taking that position? So, we created a space, an informal, kind of a safe space for people to meet. And, we brought together somewhere between 20 and 25 countries, and, aimed for a representative grouping of countries. Obviously, you wanted a lot of the major economies there, but you also, for legitimacy's sake of this conversation, you needed the small island states, you needed the least developing countries. And it takes a while for them to establish some trust. So, I mean, we'd actually had been doing this informal convening for a number of years before we launched this particular focused effort pre-Paris. And we basically spent more than 100 hours in conversations, and walked through most of the key issues that were on the negotiating agenda. And it provided the opportunity for people to actually better understand what was behind another country's position. They could take the time to explain, and just having that understanding of why they're coming from there makes it easier to begin to visualize, well, what are some landing zones here? What are some possible ways we can achieve outcomes? Frankly, that set of conversations was, I think, maybe one of my most meaningful experiences and contributions over the years. We resulted with the final product was only 6 or 7 pages long, but it essentially outlined some of the core architecture of the Paris Agreement. We put it out there maybe 5 or 6 months before Paris, so that it could socialize, a term we use. And I do think that it played a pretty pivotal role in setting the stage for what finally emerged.
Now, Paris is the first UN climate agreement that makes reference to non-state actors. And we certainly saw after the Paris Agreement, more and more corporates adopting their own voluntary emission commitments. Some of this was in the sense of the sort of "we're still in Paris" campaign that was going for a while, or some business leaders wanting to say we're Paris aligned. So when we think about the actions now in the private sector, one of the things that you've now been working on for Secretary John Kerry is this energy transition accelerator that looks at a way of trying to engage and work in developing countries by channeling some of these voluntary corporate efforts. Can you describe a little bit about the vision for this and what we might expect going forward?
Sure, but I want to reflect first a little bit on the way in which Paris has had this important signaling effect, I call it, because you're right, it is the first climate agreement to refer to non-state actors. But I think part of that evolution we were discussing earlier was the recognition that this is a whole of society effort, right? It requires every sphere of society really throwing in. And I think Paris may be unique, somewhat unique among multilateral agreements. Typically a multilateral agreement is about the behavior of parties, countries, nation states, right? Paris, I think, sent a signal to society as a whole that has begun to be incorporated. In a way, it's provided a North Star for all different spheres. And you see that in the adoption by so many companies of net zero goals or 1.5 aligned targets. So I think we may determine in time that signaling effect is as profound an outcome of Paris as the actual actions by governments. But yeah, I mean, Secretary Kerry attaches a great deal of importance to the role of the private sector. He understands the private sector as an essential partner in this effort, as a source of innovation, as a source of capital, and which leads me to the energy transition accelerator. So the objective of the energy transition accelerator is to catalyze private capital to help developing countries accelerate the transition of their power sectors from fossil to clean power. And it is a public-private partnership in a sense, because the means by which we are seeking to catalyze that capital is through a carbon crediting program, an innovative carbon crediting program. It basically is empowering countries to generate high-quality carbon credits resulting from their implementation of ambitious transition strategies. Now, those credits are of value if there are people interested in acquiring them, okay? So, we're looking to the private sector, not as the exclusive demand, but as a significant source of demand for these credits. And, there's a lot of emphasis right now on making sure that any credits offered in the market are indeed high integrity, of high quality. So we are taking a jurisdictional approach to crediting, which is different than the traditional project-based approach. Historically, credits result from discrete standalone projects, but that introduces a lot of complications. And in the forestry sector, for instance, You might pay to preserve this stand of forest over here, but over there, they're cutting down trees. So it's like, what are we accomplishing? So, people began introducing the jurisdictional concept within the forestry sector as a way to manage that the emissions leakage, as we call it. So we are now introducing that same approach within the power sector because there's strong emphasis at the moment on decommissioning coal plants. Well, you could pay a country to shut down a coal plant over here, but again, what's to keep them from just ramping up generation in the other coal plants over here? So if you approach it from a sectoral scale or a jurisdictional scale, it's a way to manage that risk. So that's the crediting approach we're taking, and we are working with lots of people within the voluntary carbon market space to ensure that companies have the opportunity to acquire these credits and apply them toward their voluntary climate strategies. So it's got a lot of technical complexity, but it's also got some political complexity as well.
And so you'll be announcing the details, some details at the COP.
Yes. So we introduced the concept back at COP27.
Right.
We've had a pretty strong team dedicated to now designing the initiative. We will be introducing the basic framework for the ETA, and hope to have a number of countries and companies standing with us expressing their strong interest in participating. And then we will have to continue work to get to the full details.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've just got more questions and we'll open it up for the audience. So be ready. We'll be passing around the mic for that. We had promised that we would be taking stock here today. The global community is also in the process of taking stock. Part of COP28 is a global stock take. I would say from my vantage point, that and the loss and damage issues are probably the two biggest issues within the UN, the formal UN climate negotiations to be addressed at the COP. So first, help us understand a little bit about the global stock take within the UN process, but then I'd love to hear sort of how you take stock of the effort and the progress over these many years.
So this is an important feature of the Paris Agreement. Every 5 years, this is the first one, parties come together and take stock of collective progress toward the long-term goals of the agreement. And we talked about the mitigation goal, 2 and 1.5 degrees. There is also an adaptation goal and a finance goal. So it's focused on taking stock of progress against all 3 of those goals. I'm gonna focus primarily on the mitigation side, but for us, it's important that the outcome of this global stock take, first off, take note of the progress that has been made. Second, identify the very significant gaps remaining, and third, point toward the additional actions that are needed. In terms of the progress that has been made, countries have their NDCs. We've talked about the influence on non-state actors. I think perhaps one of the best measures of the progress made are the estimates by the IEA, the International Energy Agency, of where we are with respect to temperature rise. So pre-Paris, IEA projected that we were on a path toward 3.5 degrees of warming. So obviously well beyond the 2 degree or 1.5 degree marks. Right now, the IEA calculates that with policies now in place, right, we are on the path to 2.5. Okay, so still too much, but a significant improvement over 3.5. The IEA also calculates that if all countries actually followed through on all of the targets and commitments they've announced, we would be on a path to 1.7. Okay, so there's a difference between policies actually in place and targets and goals announced. Lots of countries have said, yeah, we plan to be net zero by 2050 or whenever. They haven't yet put in place the policies to actually deliver on that. If they did, okay, we could be on track to 1.7, which is well below 2. Still not 1.5, but significant progress. Okay, so we still have this ambition gap. We're not on track to 1.5. We have an implementation gap. We're not implementing what we've promised. but some significant improvement. In terms of what we would like to see coming out of the global stocktake, and I should add that the cycle in the Paris Agreement is that after the global stocktake, parties then come forward with a new round of nationally determined contributions. So the purpose of the stocktake is to inform parties as they tee up their next round of nationally determined contributions. So we think that there are some important messages that should be coming out of the global stocktake. One of them is about, well, a lot of it is focused on sort of the imperatives in this decade. What do we need to accomplish this decade to get us on path to 1.5? We need to put the global energy system on a path to decarbonizing. And that is about phasing out unabated fossil fuels. It's about no longer permitting unabated coal plants. So there are some specific messages there. We also need to achieve net zero deforestation by 2030. So we need to speak to that. We also need to move much more rapidly to reduce the non-CO2 emissions, the so-called super pollutants, methane and HFCs, which right now actually account for half of the warming we're experiencing. We focus on CO2, we need to focus on CO2, but we've been neglecting to some degree these non-CO2 pollutants that are huge contributors, and actually the most effective way to reduce warming in the near term is to reduce those emissions. So we need to focus on that. But we also think that it's important that the global stocktake signal to parties some expectations about their next round of NDCs, that they should be economy-wide. They need to encompass their entire economies. They need to cover all greenhouse gases, because some of the major emitters have CO2 only NDCs right now, and they need to be aligned with 1.5. So I think that those are some of the messages that we're working hard to ensure come out of the global stocktake.
Okay, so there is this challenge, you noted both the ambition gap and the implementation gap. You noted earlier that the sort of intertemporal challenge of climate is different today. We're actually experiencing some of the adverse impacts of a changing climate today. This has animated a lot of the discussion about loss and damage. So in Sharm el-Sheikh, we agreed on loss and damage, although as someone who's occasionally been on the inside as well as an observer, I also noted we agreed on a committee to do the difficult work that they've been trying to undertake that difficult work over the past now 11 months. Help us understand a little bit about what is, in general, the idea behind loss and damage, and what might we expect on this issue in Dubai.
So the notion of loss and damage is that even if we do a great job on mitigation, reducing emissions, even if we do a great job supporting countries on adaptation and coping with the anticipated impacts, at this point, there will be inevitable and irreversible impacts for some countries, loss and damage. I mean, small island states, will lose land and in some cases perhaps cease to exist. So there's a sort of class of impacts that at this point are unavoidable. So what do we do about that? So this is an issue that has risen to the fore within the negotiations. Early on, the U.S. and other developed countries sort of laid down a marker, a red line, if you will, that look, let's talk about this, but we can't look at it in the frame of liability and compensation. This can't become a means for somebody to try to assess liability. So that's sort of been put off to the side. But it is about how do you mobilize resources and support for countries that are suffering loss and damage to be able to come to terms with that. So, and we have generally taken the approach that, look, there are lots of different programs and resources that can be brought to bear on this issue. Last year at COP27 in Sharm, it was agreed that there would be a new fund established to help address loss and damage. And that wasn't necessarily an outcome that we supported coming into COP27, but it's an outcome we embraced coming out of COP27. And The transitional committee that you mentioned, was assigned the task of actually figuring out what does that look like and teeing up a decision at COP28 in Dubai. It's been somewhat challenging. In fact, they held their, I think, fourth meeting where they were expecting to wrap up and didn't. So there's now another meeting scheduled. But so what is to be decided at COP28 is the structure and the nature of this fund. It's more complicated than it might appear. One of the issues for the US, for instance, is how do you define sort of the donor base for this fund? Who should contribute to it, okay? Because historically, going back to Rio, the expectation has been developed countries are the ones who are supposed to provide finance. Well, we're at a point in time where that distinction between developed and developing has become quite blurry. And some of the countries that consider themselves developing are actually quite well resourced. So we think it's time to expand the notion of the donor pool to include other countries that actually have the means to be contributing. So that'll be one of the issues to be debated and decided. But the other thing is that, I mean, establishing a fund is one thing. Funding the fund is another thing. Okay, so hopefully we'll come out of COP28 with a fund established, but then we will face the challenge of actually mobilizing the resources to put into that fund. We've been down these roads before. It's not easy for the US. It's not something an administration can decide unilaterally. It's something that we need Congress to actually appropriate funds for. So we'll see how quickly we actually are able to muster the necessary resources. And at the same time, we still think it's important that we be working through other channels to bring to bear other programs and resources that can help countries with loss and damage.
Great, thanks. How long are you going to be in Dubai? As long as you need to be.
As long as I need to be, which may or may not be the full 2 weeks.
Okay.
I haven't booked my flights just yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me open it up to the audience now for questions, please. Yes.
Hi, my name is Greg Beyer, and I work in sustainable finance. So I have 2 questions for you, and they're tough questions, and my apologies in advance. But
you only get one tough question.
Well, maybe one's easy for you, and maybe the other's tough. So for your energy transition accelerator and for the loss and damage fund, anybody who has a lot of experience working in emerging markets, developing countries, knows that corruption's huge. How in the world are you planning to implement bringing money in and making sure it's used properly and just doesn't disappear into funding systems of patronage? And second question, China and India have both roughly, China has about 65 years of domestic coal reserves at 2019 use rates, and India has about 111 at 2019 use rates. How in the world can we get China and India on board to get off coal when they have such huge domestic coal reserves that provide them so much energy security?
So on the corruption issue, it's a tough one, and obviously doesn't just apply in this sphere. In the context of the ETA, the way we are designing this is that the revenue from these credit sales is expected to go to the governments, but we would be asking for a plan up front on the distribution of that revenues. So there would be transparency even before they receive the revenues about how they intend to allocate it. And then there will need to be some means of continuous transparency about the distribution of those funds. So hopefully that can help mitigate that concern. On the coal question, I mean, that is really such an essential question at this point. India actually has made offered some very promising indications of late that they are intending to ramp down the construction of new coal plants. A high priority for us is getting China to do the same. Okay, China doesn't need external finance. So the fact that G7 countries have said they're going to stop financing the construction of coal plants isn't necessarily going to help there. And I think it is really a matter of the international community as a whole leaning on China. I mean, look, we all have a stake in China's energy future. and in the decisions they make on how they are going to meet their energy needs. Yes, they have the coal. Others have the coal too. We've stopped building coal plants in this country. And the U.S. Has been very clear in the need for China to do the same. Secretary Kerry has placed a very high priority on bilateral conversations with the Chinese around this and other issues. We need other countries to kind of join us in that call. So, one of the priorities for many countries at COP28 will be the adoption of a renewable energy goal, a goal of tripling renewable energy capacity or deployment by 2030. Super important, okay? But we actually think that needs to be coupled with a commitment to stop new unabated coal plants, because bringing the renewables up is great, but it's just as vital that at the same time we are closing the pipeline on new coal plants. This is not something that we can decide for the Chinese. The Chinese have to come to that, and other countries often feel inhibited, if you will, in terms of speaking to China about what China should do. But we need a global voice on this, and we need civil society to be speaking out much more prominently on these issues as well.
I'll make one quick comment on India. There's a lot of discussion about like, what do we do with finance and how do we help developing countries bring down the cost of some of these new technologies? I think what the world has done by subsidizing solar and driving down the cost of solar enables a country like India, which a decade ago would not have thought of solar as playing a meaningful role in its power sector. And now it has a goal of having more than 100 gigawatts of installed solar, really only made possible because you had, and there were some of us, and I'll put my hand up, who thought the German subsidies for solar were way too generous. We've had generous subsidies for a while in the US, generous subsidies in Japan. We've had issues as well that there's been subsidies on the supply side. Some may be thinking in conflict with the WTO, but on the supply side to drive down the cost. But in general, by making this technology really cheap, it makes it easier for a developing country to think about a non-fossil pathway moving forward in the power sector in a way they would not have, I think, just 10 years ago.
That's absolutely right. And I think that, we anticipate some significant spillover effect, for instance, from the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, in terms of bringing down the cost of technologies to make them more readily accessible and affordable elsewhere.
Great.
Elliot, thank you very much for spending some time with us today and your service in this pretty important cause for the globe. You noted that the pathway to what we may be able to achieve for temperature is uncertain, and how we perform in the next few years might lock in some pretty bad outcomes. I've been noting an increased discussion about some potential developments where, I don't know what the term is, let's call it atmospheric engineering options, where a unilateral actor may be able to try and reverse some of the atmospheric properties that are good. And that raises some concerning questions about second and third order effect. Are you seeing that being a topic potentially at the COP about controlling research or encouraging research into such options, but controlling unilateral action that we may not know the full impact of?
It's not an issue that is on the formal negotiating agenda. I expect there will be lots of events actually focused on those issues. So, experts in civil society taking a look at that set of issues. And we certainly support research into the potential application and risks of those approaches, as well as whether there may be some need for some new forms of governance in anticipation of the deployment of those approaches. I would say that the one that is furthest along is carbon dioxide removal. Actually removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and there are some pretty significant incentives built into the IRA to support the development of that technology. I talked earlier about some of the imperatives for this decade in terms of energy decarbonization and deforestation. That's another one that's been identified by the EA, actually, is scaling up those technologies because I think at this point, most, if not every comprehensive analysis suggests that we are going to need to rely to some degree on carbon dioxide removal, direct air capture to reach that net zero state. So that's an area where we've been leaning in pretty heavily.
So one quick follow-up on that, and we'll go to Helene after this. So in September, we had this Climate Overshoot Commission issued this report. So it was a number of former heads of state, led by the former head of the WTO. One of the leaders from the French government involved in the Paris negotiations was a member of this. So they identified this challenge that we risk overshooting our goals. As you alluded to, right now, we're not on the path to 1.5, and we've got to do more to even implement our goals if we're going to even get below 2. Does the Climate Overshoot Commission, they put out these recommendations, but they also use the term that we hadn't really used that much before on the overshoot in the kind of, I would say, broader policy community. Those of us who are sort of eggheads have been talking about this for a while. Do you see any of that starting to influence how people are going to talk or think about this issue in the UN climate talks? Or is it like that report came out in September, everything we're working on has been like on a train that left the station either in Sharm el-Sheikh or Glasgow or what have you, and so it may take time to really get a sense of how much we'll be talking about the climate overshoot?
It's a good question. I guess we should look in the outcome of the global stock hike to see whether that concept is taken on board, because certainly we are very mindful of the reality that at this point, a plausible 1.5 degree scenario likely entails some degree of overshoot. And then using technology, either technological or land-based approaches to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere to bring us back down to 1.5. I think that's fairly well understood within the climate analytics community, right? But it's not something that has entered really the parlance more broadly. But I think it's a reality at this point.
Hi, my name is Elliot. I'm a postdoc fellow here. I had a question on the loss and damage fund. So you mentioned uncertainties on the donor space, but I was wondering about just what you see the US government or other parties seeing as what loss and damage is in particular, and in particular in the timing of addressing loss and damage, because the way you were talking about it, it kind of sounded you need to wait until those horrible things have happened for countries to kind of ask for something, or because like the language is actually not very clear there in the Paris Agreement itself. And so I was wondering whether you see a role for, I guess, advanced preparedness to deal with what could happen and be qualified for as loss and damage down the line.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to imply that, and I'll have to be honest that I'm not directly involved in that set of issues, but I do think that they are scoped to include anticipatory actions so that you don't have to wait till somebody has actually suffered the loss or the damage to be entitled to some form of support. I think that that's only reasonable and logical to be making resources available as quickly as possible to minimize. I mean, actually, I think there is language about averting, minimizing, and addressing, maybe is the sort of the trilogy of concepts incorporated there. So certainly we would support directing resources as early as possible to help minimize.
Hi, I'm Rob Werner from Concord, New Hampshire. I also am the state director for the League of Conservation Voters in New Hampshire. I also been involved with the ICLEI process and local governments. I've done quite a lot of work in Concord around community power, utility scale solar, and so forth. Could you speak to the importance and influence of local action, particularly as we see it today in the COP process?
It's important. So I didn't mention, when we were talking earlier about non-state actors, and non-state is this weird term because in that case we mean nation states, right? So states and local governments are, lumped into this non-state category, but they play an absolutely vital role. And I mean, I referred earlier to the whole of society effort and talked about the private sector, but look, particularly during the previous administration, Joe referred to We Are Still In. The ability to show up at the COP with people from the United States, representatives of different spheres, including sitting governments at the state and local level, to highlight the actions that were being taken at that time within the United States to address emissions and other aspects of the climate challenge, was absolutely vital in communicating to the rest of the world that while the sitting administration may have no interest, the American people are in fact still in, as we said at the time. So the state and local governments have a vital role to play in terms of addressing the issue domestically and enabling us to achieve the international commitments we have set for the United States and be able to demonstrate that commitment and action to the international community. So thank you.
Who has the mic? I have. Oh, you have the mic, yes.
Thank you so much for the talk today. I was interested, you pointed out the influence that the chair has on COP in determining what consensus is. This might be a tricky question, but going into UAE COP, what are you thoughtful of, given kind of the pre-suspicions or concerns and questions around the presidency and the previous ad hoc leadership of the president of the UAE COP?
Sure, and I don't have any sense of Dr. Sultan's chairing style, so I don't know what to anticipate in terms of that. But I mean, I think it's helpful to understand how the selection of a country as host and president, how that is handled from a process standpoint. So the COP presidency rotates among the UN regions, 5 or 6 UN regions each year. And each of those regions offers up a host country. So it was the consensus of the countries within that region that the UAE should serve as the host for the COP this year. And then whichever government is in that hosting capacity decides for itself who's going to be the COP president, who's going to sit in the seat of COP president. And I don't think there's any precedent for anybody to pressure a country to not be the COP president or who should be in that role. You mentioned Dr. Sultan's role. I think it's still his role as the head of ADNOC, the national oil company. He also is the head of Masdar, which has been the vehicle through which the UAE has ramped up investments in renewable energy. So in a way, he sits very much at the center of the energy economy in the UAE and both sides of that economy. So he is in a good position to understand both the challenges and the opportunities. And I think, frankly, in occupying the seat as COP president, sort of has shown a spotlight on the imperative of the UAE following through on its commitment to achieving net zero. I think by 2050, or whatever target date they've set for themselves, but also, casting a spotlight, frankly, on the challenge and opportunity for the global energy economy. So I think, having put themselves under the microscope, if you will, people will be watching closely for how they handle the COP and for the outcomes that are achieved. And I think, we and everyone will have to judge on the basis of the part they play in achieving ambitious outcomes.
Time for one more question.
Thank you. My name is Linus B. I've worked a lot on the European emissions trading system in Europe and topics surrounding that. And my question is sort of with the CBAM implemented, right? The carbon border adjustment mechanism is gradually being phased in. Countries exporting to the European Union will be forced to pay, for carbon at the border. And what we've seen since that has been implemented, there's been lots of countries sort of trying to talk to the EU, talk them out of it. It's not going to happen. CBAM's coming. And then suddenly interest rose in implementing carbon pricing. And my hypothesis, maybe a bit provocative, do you think there's a chance that in 5 years, carbon pricing is again being discussed in the United States Congress? Because global pressure will be high enough. India is establishing its system. China, I mean, it's not biting yet, but they're ratcheting it up. The IRA is great. I'm a huge fan, but it's all carrots. Where's the stick? And will it be back on the agenda?
Joe? No. I want to first reflect on one of the many ironies we've witnessed over the years on these issues. Joe will recall that when we went to Kyoto, it was the US making the case for use of market mechanisms. And we, succeeded in building into the Kyoto architecture different forms of emissions trading. And that was, we met some very strong resistance from the EU at the time. I mean, our starting point was the successful experience we'd had in using a cap and trade system to reduce acid rain cheaper and faster than anybody anticipated. And I know Rob Stavins was deeply involved in that effort way back when. So the US was the champion of those approaches. As it turned out, we have not enacted a cap and trade system or a carbon tax, any form of carbon pricing, whereas the EU, which resisted, has now led the way. So will carbon pricing be back on the agenda? I couldn't rule it out, I guess, but I would note that, I think CBAM is looking at ways to account for carbon emissions other than, based on a pricing approach. So, I mean, if a country can demonstrate that it is meeting the level of emissions reduction required to avoid the border measure, whether or not by virtue of carbon pricing, then that'll pass, right? So it's not essential that a country employ carbon pricing to be able to avoid border. You're right. I mean, these things have not been fully decided, but I think. With all due respect and appreciation for economists, okay, there has long been a notion of, well, if we only had a global carbon price, that would solve the problem. Well, from a policy design standpoint, true enough. From a political economy standpoint, I think that remains an elusive goal. The organization I used to work for, Q Center, then C2ES, our mission, frankly, was to enact comprehensive carbon policy in the United States. And we envisioned that as market-based policy. So we spent years, along with many other people, working toward a cap and trade system. And came close at one point, okay, but didn't succeed. And then everybody started talking about carbon tax instead. And it's like, okay, well, all right, sure. But that didn't succeed either. We also thought that it should be enacted on a bipartisan basis in order to be durable. So, leap forward, what do we wind up with was the IRA, which you say is full of carrots, very effective carrots, enacted on a strictly partisan basis. So it was not our vision, but I very much welcome it. I think it will have a profound influence. It will embed action in our economy, have those spillover effects I was suggesting earlier in terms of lowering the cost of technology for other countries. So, it's a tricky, confusing game deciding what policies not only will be effective, but can make it through the political system. And at the end of the day, that's what counts, is like the policies that can be enacted and are effective. Right. So I would welcome a resurgence of interest in carbon pricing as a mechanism here in the United States. 5 years, maybe. We'll see.
I have an opinion on this, but I'm mindful of the time. So before we wrap up, let me note that we will reconvene noon next Monday with Dustin Tingley, a colleague on the faculty in the Department of Government. Next week, we're meeting in the Allison Dining Room in 5th floor of the Taubman Building. And finally, please join me in thanking Elliot Diringer for his insights here today. Thank you so much, Elliot. That was great. Well done. It was fun.